I have probably told you this story. I'm pretty sure I mentioned this to somebody not too long ago. But a while back, I introduced my kids to the board game called Clue. Most of you know what the board game Clue is all about, perhaps. It's really a murder mystery game where you're trying to figure out who committed the murder and what instrument they committed with it and what room they committed the murder. And it's a board game, and you kind of go around and you go to room, and as you go to each room, each person gets to have a guess about who did what, where, and when, and with how or what. And you know how it goes, kind of. But, you know, the way the kind of the game plays out is you give these guesses like, you know, Mr. Plum did it with the, you know, candlestick in the conservatory or something like that. That's how the game kind of works. Well, I introduced my kids to this several months ago, and that was their favorite game for a little while. We hadn't played it in a while, and what I didn't do is I didn't explain what the game was really all about. I just taught them how to play it, and I was kind of curious how long it would take them to figure out that they were missing a big piece of information about what this game is really all about, because they would go through and they were saying, well, you know, Mr. Plum did it with the knife in the, you know, library, and they've been doing this for a while, and finally it hit Irene, my daughter. It hit Irene. She said to me one day, she said, well, what did they do? And I kind of, you know, smiled, and I said, what do you mean? She said, well, we keep saying, you know, somebody did it in the light. You know, I want to know what they did. At this point, all they knew was this is a game of the process of elimination, and there were 3 guesses in that envelope in the middle of the card, and, you know, the middle of the game, and they wanted to know what we did. And I kind of laughed at her. I said, well, actually, what they did is they murdered somebody. She went, oh. I said, yeah, we're trying to figure out, you know, go through the clues and figure out what happened and who did it. And she goes, oh, okay, you know, we went on, you know. Well, folks, this morning, we are going to play Clue. Say, really? We are? Yeah, we are. It's not a board game, but we're going to play Clue. And actually, what we're going to see in just a minute is this actually is a murder mystery to some extent. There is some people being murdered in this chapter. And we need to find the identity of the murderer. But this game's going to work a little differently. Because the way this game works, forgive me for using that analogy, it isn't a game, but I'm going to use that analogy. The way this game works is we actually already know the name of the murderer. So what do you mean? Well, we've actually seen it back in chapter 14, and we saw it last week in chapter 16. We know the name of this murderer is Babylon the Great. In fact, in this chapter, in verse 5, she will be named Babylon the Great. We know the name of the murderer. The problem is we don't know necessarily what her true identity really is. In fact, over the centuries, there has been a lot of debate to actually identify who is this Babylon that Revelation talks about. It's mentioned again in chapter 14. It's mentioned in chapter 16, as we saw last week, and it's obviously mentioned in this chapter and chapter 18 as well. And the big question mark has always been, what's the identity of Babylon? So this morning, I'm going to preach to you on the title of a subject called Identifying Babylon. You say, well, how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to do that by following the clues of the passage. There's a lot of, in fact, somebody has made the observation, one of the reasons we have so much debate is there are a ton of clues in these 2 chapters about Babylon. It tells us so much information, but the problem is some of the clues seem somewhat conflicting. They're not sure how to integrate them together to come to some kind of definite conclusion about these things. Well, I would like to suggest this morning, folks, that I believe we can arrive at a fairly confident conclusion about the identity of who Babylon really is. So this morning, I want to preach to you about identifying Babylon. Now, in order to do this, I think it would be really helpful to help you understand for you to understand how this chapter, Revelation 17, is organized. Say, why is that the case? Well, as you know, when you approach something that seems to be disorganized, and Scripture, by the way, isn't disorganized, I'm not making that implication, but since there's so much information here, one of the best things to do is start kind of getting it organized so you can actually sift through it and begin actually reasoning about what is here. So let me try to help you get the chapter organized, then we'll begin going through the details just a little bit. It won't take long to do this. This chapter is divided pretty much into 3 categories. The first 2 verses are introductory material that gives us 3 facts about Babylon. We'll go through those facts in just a moment, but the first 2 verses are introductory material. Verses 3 down to verse 16, we are given a description of Babylon. And again, we're going to go through that material in somewhat detail. Those verses 3 through 6, it is a description of Babylon. And then starting in verse 7, what John receives to the end of the chapter is more of an explanation of the description that he's seeing of Babylon. So we've got, first of all, the first two verses, introductory material, 3 facts there about Babylon. Then verses 3 through 6, a description of Babylon. Then verses 7 to the end of the chapter, an explanation about what John has had described to him. All right? Now, based on that division, that's how we're going to approach this passage this morning. First of all, let's look at the 3 introductory facts in the first 2 verses. Let's just read them. It says this, "And there came one of the 7 angels which had one of the 7 vials, and talked with me, and saying unto me, Come hither, I will show thee the judgment of the great whore that sitteth upon many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth have been made drunk with the wine of her fornication." Now, 3 introductory facts about Babylon in those 2 verses. First of all, number 1, God tells us that Babylon is a woman. Babylon is a woman, but not just any woman. In this passage, she's called a whore or a harlot. Of course, that's talking about a woman who is a woman for hire, who solicits payment for intimacy. And the reality is that is a description that God does not want you to forget. Because as you continue through chapter 17 into chapter 18, he continues to remind us of this over and over and over and over again. In fact, in verse 4 and verse 5, verse 15, verse 16 of this chapter, and in verses 3, 7, and 9 of the next chapter, it reminds us of this person's or this woman's immorality and her sensuality. So that's a fact God does not want us to forget. He's emphasizing that in this passage. The second fact about this woman is that Babylon is highlighted at the end of verse 1, is that she is positioned upon many waters. That's her location. You say, what does that mean? We'll get to the interpretation in just a little while. But that's the second fact. She's positioned upon many waters. And then the third fact that we have about this woman, Babylon, comes in verse 2, is that she has certain relationships. In fact, there are 2 relationships mentioned in verse 2. She has a certain relationship to kings, and she has a certain relationships to the rest of the world, or the peoples of the world. In other words, she is distinct in her identity from human government, and she is distinct in her identity from all the population of the world. That's what verse 2 is trying to, I think, impress upon us. Whatever this is, whoever Babylon is, apparently she's not human government. She's distinct from that because she has a relationship with these kings, and she cannot be identified necessarily just with everybody else in the world. So you say, well, who's that? Well, again, let's keep exploring some of the clues. We're going to move now to the second section. That's the introductory, first 3 facts. Second section is a description, and we're approaching this a little academically this morning. My apologies, but this is going to be a little more academic this morning. But we're just getting clues together, okay? Let's see the description of Babylon. In verses 3 through 6, as we identify or try to figure out who Babylon is, I'm going to break these verses down into 4 more facts. A description with 4 more facts of who Babylon is. First of all, in verse 3, notice with me, this woman is sitting on a scarlet beast. It says here, "So he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting upon a scarlet-colored beast, full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns." In other words, she is sitting on the scarlet-colored beast, but folks, there should be something about verse 4. I'm sorry, did I read verse 4? Yeah, verse 3. That sounds familiar to you. What does that sound like? Because we've already studied this. What does it sound like in verse 3 when I read here about this beast that has 7 heads and 10 horns? Where have we seen that before? What's that? No? Kind of in Daniel, but not within our study in Revelation. Where have we seen this? I hear whispers. Yeah, it's back all the way to chapter 13. Go back there just real briefly. In chapter 13, we are told of the same beast, I would argue, who also has 7 heads and 10 horns right there in verse 1. John says, having 7 heads and 10 horns. And upon his 10 horns and upon the heads, the names of blasphemy. And I would like to argue, folks, that what we have in verse 3 of chapter 17, John is talking about the same beast we saw in chapter 13, verse 1. Now, just to remind you of the nature of that beast that we saw in chapter 13, because I'm going to interpret this According the same way in chapter 17, we saw two primary identities of that beast in chapter 13. First of all, what we saw is that beast was clearly an amalgamation of many different human governments that existed in the past. Do y'all remember that? As John goes through and describes that beast in chapter 13, he gives all those animals, right? He sees part of a lion, he sees part of a leopard, he sees part of a bear, and we notice that tie-in with Daniel chapter 7, which is where Stephen was going a little bit, and Daniel chapter 7, that clearly was a succession of kingdoms that came. We interpreted those kingdoms as Babylon and Persia and Greece. And I believe clearly what we have here in this passage is a description, once again, of those kingdoms that came. That same beast that was clearly an amalgamation of different kingdoms that have come throughout human history. However, we noticed a second thing about the identity of that beast. And that very simply, folks, was that this beast was also clearly an end times government that will be headed by an individual who also is called a beast. Gets a little confusing. There's a lot of beasts going on and running around here, but he's also called a beast. This end times government would be the seventh head to that beast that would have 10 horns. But the point verse 3, I believe, is making is that this woman Babylon is apparently controlling the beast of human government. Why would I make that point in verse 3? She's controlling the beast of human government. You ever ride a horse? Who controls the horse? Whoever's in the saddle. Where is this woman? She's in the saddle. She's riding the beast. Apparently, she's in some control of the beast. I'm just making that point. We'll get back to that in a minute. That's the first fact from the first description of this Babylon. Second description of the Babylon in verse 4 is that she catches everyone's attention because she's dressed, or literally she's gilded with an impressive display of wealth. Look at her wealth. Verse 4, it says, "And the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet color, and decked with gold and precious stones and pearls, having a golden cup in her hand, full of abominations and filthiness of her fornication." In other words, folks, this woman is decked out. She is gilded with all kinds of wealth. She's got scarlet clothes on, there's gold, there's pearls, there's a golden cup in her hand. This woman is impressive in the display of her wealth. Just going to leave it right there. Let's move on to the third factor, third description. And we need to slow down on this one, and we need to unpack this just a little bit. Let's read the verse. Here's the third description in verse 5 of this woman. It says, "Upon her forehead was a name written, Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth." And actually, in the Greek, at least in my Bible, I don't know about yours, I'm kind of curious, how many in your Bible that phrase, Mystery Babylon and following, is all in capital letters? All that? Okay, some translations probably have that, or at least editions have that. Your editors put that in that way. Mine's that way, and I appreciate that because it's like, wow, that's like a major point, and it is. This is a major point we need to settle down in. In fact, just to explain that wording a little bit, it says on her forehead was a name written, and in my Bible, the word mystery is actually in capital letters as if it's part of the name. I'd like to suggest to you that actually it's not part of the name. It's a mysterious name that has been a mystery for human history that God's now revealing to us. And the name actually begins with the word Babylon. Babylon, the great, the mother of harlots and the abominations of the earth. You say, well, what does this tell us about Babylon itself? Well, two things I want to point out this morning about this verse. Two facts that you need to know. Number one, the name Babylon. Let's talk about that for just a moment. The name Babylon. I don't know if you know anything about the name Babylon in Scripture, but the fact of the matter is it's used a lot. In fact, the term, well, let me just point out, where do you believe the first place that the word Babylon is used in your Bible? Do you know the place? The very first time it's used? Okay, actually that's true. It goes all the way back to the book of Genesis, specifically chapter 10. And here's what chapter 10 tells us about Babylon. It says that after the flood, this is the days right after Noah, Noah's family gets off the ark. Of course, Noah has 3 sons, right? And what we discover as you read through chapter 10 is there's a delineation of different descendants of Noah. And we find that one of Noah's grandsons, his name Nimrod in that chapter. And Nimrod had a certain ambition, apparently. He was apparently a great leader of men. He was known as a great hunter before the Lord, a great mighty man, our translation says. Not sure exactly what that means. It may be literally he was a great hunter. It could be he was just a great leader of men. But what it says is that he had an ambition to establish a kingdom. And he went into the land of Shinar, which is around the Euphrates River, which we, of course, have seen recently in our study of Revelation. And he founded 4 different cities that would become a kingdom that he would establish. And the first city that's named in a succession of 4 is the city of Babel. You say, oh, heard that before. Tower of Babel? Yeah. It's actually mentioned in chapter 12 before we find out more of the backstory or more of some things or events that took place in chapter 11. So Babel's first mentioned there in chapter 10. But in chapter 11, you know the famous event, right? What happened at Babel in chapter 11? Okay, yeah, but what was the, okay, you know the Tower of Babel, you know these men built a tower, but what was their motivation as they built this? Do you remember what Genesis 11 says? Okay, first of all, they wanted to make this grand, huge tower. They wanted to build it all the way up into the heavens. We're not sure how tall they really were able to get this thing, but my guess is it was probably pretty impressive by the time God did something about it. But what was their motivation for building this thing? You remember what it says in Genesis 11? I know I'm catching you off guard. You haven't had a chance to read this recently. Okay, that was one thing. I don't know if you remember this, but God commanded Noah and his family to what when they got off the ark? They were to scatter across the world. They were to go to different places and populate the world again. That's what they were going to do. Apparently Nimrod, the grandson of Moses, had a different plan. They didn't want to scatter. They wanted to be congregated in one location. Again, I don't know what all the motivations were, but that was one. They wanted to rebel against the command of God. They did not want to be separated out and go across the world. The second thing that they wanted to do was what? Remember this? Genesis 11 tells us they wanted to make a name for themselves. They wanted a reputation in the world. Apparently some people had scattered, I guess, but they wanted to have a reputation. They wanted to be a place that you could come. They wanted to be a place that you could visit, a place that everybody knew the name of Nimrod, the name of Babel, and the 4 cities in the plains of Shinar around where they were building this tower. And so people have asked the question, well, what was in their hearts as they did that? Well, clearly it was to rebel against God. Clearly they didn't want to obey God. They wanted to do what they wanted to do. God was not, let me say it this way, God was not their God anymore. Who was their God at this point? Well, at the very foundation of everything, their own heart, their own life, their own way, that was their God. But as different linguists have looked at the word Babel, they have discovered that something I think is very interesting. They say that the word Babel actually is a little bit of a play on words. You say, what do you mean? Well, as archaeologists have uncovered different facts about ancient civilization, they have uncovered the origins of the word Babel that they believe is a Hebrew rendering of an ancient Sumerian or Akkadian word that simply means the gate of the gods. In fact, in Hebrew, the word Bavel means confusion, which is what God says in Genesis 11. It was named Babel because there was confusion. Why was there confusion? Remember what God did? Yeah, he changed all the languages. You say, why did God do that? Because he understood that as mankind continued to progress and they shared a common language, it would be much easier for them to rebel against God and go their own way. So one of the things that God did to actually kind of mitigate the rebellion of mankind is to actually confound languages, to confuse languages. The Hebrew word Babel does mean confusion. But actually, as well, in the ancient Akkadian or perhaps Sumerian, the word Bavil, which is very similar in spelling, means gate of the gods. And there are some who speculate, and this is a little debatable, I appreciate that, but there's some who speculate that one of the reasons that maybe it's called Babel in Hebrews 10 before Tower of Babel in Hebrews 11 is because it was Nimrod's intention to reject the God that was the God of Noah and go after his own God and build this great tower as a tower to his God. In other words, a lot of biblicists, and I would be in this category as well, believe that what Nimrod was doing and the people of Babel were doing was actually building a temple to false gods to worship their God, what they wanted to do, because they had rejected the God of Noah. You say, well, is there anything to substantiate that? Well, I think we'll get to that in a minute, but I'll point you to one more interesting side point. Many archaeologists, if you study ancient civilization, they have noticed that around the world, pretty much all different societies in ancient world had a certain kind of tower that they built to their deities. Some of you shaking your heads, you know about this. They're called ziggurats. Say, have you heard the word ziggurat before? I always thought ziggurat was a fun name. Fun little word. Ziggurat, right? So what was a ziggurat? Well, it's kind of a pyramidal sort of structure that they have found in all these different societies and cultures around the world that were built to worship the gods of each of these cultures. And somebody had asked the question and said, well, why in the world were all these different cultures using basically the same blueprint to build their temples to their god roughly the same way? And I would argue the answer was Babel. Because what did God do? Well, he confused the languages, and he scattered the people, and as they went to these different regions around the world, what did they take with them? They took with them a rebellious heart that did not want to worship the true God, and a blueprint of how to erect temples to worship their gods. So it would stand to reason, and you say, yeah, well, that's a little bit of reason. It is, but it would stand to reason that what's going on in Genesis 10 and 11 is mankind's rebellion against God to go after and worship their own gods. And God says, no, I'm going to confuse the language. I'm going to call this place Babel, which is what the Hebrew word Babel means, confusion. But with a play on words, it may actually have also been a word that was used in their native tongue to describe the gate of the gods. Now, what's interesting is that after Genesis 11, the word Babel does not appear in your Bible again. You know what word appears? By the way, it's used something like 186 more times, the exact Hebrew word. 186 more times it's used, I believe, in your Old Testament. What word is it besides Babel that's used? It's Babylon. That's what it is. Every other time it's Babylon. I'm not sure why our translators actually didn't write Babylon in Genesis 10 and 11, but that's actually the same exact word. Now, there's other variations of the Hebrew word in your Old Testament. In fact, that number increases to over 200, something like 260 times in your Old Testament, Babylon is mentioned. You say, why is that? Because, folks, the day would come in the history of the world in which a new, more powerful Babylon would rise on the same location as the ruins of Babel in the land of Shinar on the Euphrates River. And its most famous king was who? Nebuchadnezzar. And, folks, remember in Daniel, God gave him that dream of the statue. Remember that? Daniel chapter 2? He was the head of gold, and there was the chest and arms of silver. There was the belly and thighs of brass. There was the legs of iron, and the feet and toes of a mixture of iron and clay. And Nebuchadnezzar came on the scene, and God would use that man as the head of the Babylonian kingdom to do what? Punish Israel. In fact, Habakkuk's all confused by this. He can't believe that God would use somebody like the Babylonians to judge his people. Why did God judge his people? What was at the heart of all that? What had they done? They had what? They had sinned against him, and specifically how? By idol worship. They had brought in their false gods, and God says basically, okay, you're going to worship false gods? I'm going to bring in the nation that founded all this. I'm going to bring in the Babylonians, and they're going to judge you because you have rejected me and gone after false gods, and I'm bringing in the Babylonians. And folks, God explained to Nebuchadnezzar that he was that head of gold. And you remember what Nebuchadnezzar did in the very next chapter in Daniel when he found that out? What did he do? Yeah, he decided to put up a statue. You say, what kind of statue? A very tall statue, a statue of gold. A statue that the text doesn't say this, but I can't imagine it not being the case, that probably looked a little bit like him. And they actually called everybody to come worship another false idol. That's what happened in Babylon. And folks, that is the history of Babylon. Babylon was doing what Babel had done all those years before, and that is to call all the people to worship a false god. Now, I need to point out a second truth here in verse 5. We've looked at the name of Babel, but notice in verse 5 it says that Babel is the mother of harlots. What do you know about that word mother? We had kittens born this week. We had 5 kittens. My mother, has already spoken for all 5 of them. So they've already been claimed. We are very thankful. They've already been claimed. But what do you know about mothers? Yeah, they produce descendants, don't they? Why is this person called a mother? What's that? What has Babylon produced? Sin? What's that? False religions. All around the world today. It happened all throughout the ancient world. It happened to Israel as they looked at all these other gods, whether it was Baal or Ashtaroth or Molech or whatever they are. They're all out there in the Old Testament. They're all over the world today. There's all these different religions and different false worship. In fact, she's called the mother of harlots and abominations. Say, why is she called that? Because whatever happened at the tower that was built in Babel continued to reproduce harlots and result in abominations. You say, again, what happened there? Well, folks, what happened there is, I would argue, this was the first organized, man-made religion after the flood. And apparently through the use of human governments that was set up, a false religion or system of worship that they erected to make a name for themselves. And when God judged mankind, he confounded the languages. The people carried those religious or rebellious false worships to their new communities. In other words, the false religious system of Babel is elevating man over God. The false religious systems of today is elevating man over God. Somebody asks, well, why then is Babel called a harlot, or Babylon is called a harlot? That should be a fairly easy question to answer if you know your Old Testament, shouldn't it? Why is it? Go ahead, tell me. Okay, Aaron says because of a lot of female deities. That may be part of it. Folks, what was the image that God used over again throughout the Old Testament whenever he touched on this issue of his people going after false gods? It was called adultery, it was called harlotry, it was called whoring. In fact, let me just give you 2 or 3 passages. Judges chapter 2, verses 13 through 17. God is describing what happened to Israel after Joshua died. Okay? Here's what happened. It says, the children of Israel forsook the Lord and served Baal and Ashtaroth. And he said, they went a-whoring after other gods, bowed themselves down to them. Or in Judges chapter 8, Gideon made an ephod, which was kind of a clothing item that priests wore. And it says Israel went whoring after the ephod. He began worshiping the ephod and also worshiping Balaam and Baalberith, their god. Or many centuries later, Jeremiah chapter 3, God is explaining to Israel why he has not blessed them. And he says in verse 6 of that passage, hast thou seen that which backsliding Israel hath done? She has gone up upon every high mountain and upon every green tree, and there hath played the harlot. And 2 verses later, he called that kind of betrayal committing adultery. Or you get to Ezekiel 16. He tells the prophet Ezekiel that Israel, or that Jerusalem, shall know her abominations. And folks, he gets very graphic in chapter 16. I'm not going to read the chapter this morning. But he charges Israel with being a whorish woman. Why? Because to know the true God and turn from the true God and declare allegiance to the true God and reject the true God is nothing but spiritual adultery. That is what Israel did over and over and over again. In fact, if you go back to the Old Testament, you will find that God even claims or charges even nations that did not know God as committing spiritual adultery. And you go, how could that be? Because originally all the nations did know the true God. Originally, Noah was the one who knew the true God. His sons knew the true God. But at some point along the way, the nations chose to reject the true God. And God says that is adultery. That is going after and playing the whore, if you will, being unfaithful to the true creator of heaven and earth. That's why verse 5 calls Babylon the mother of harlots. After God reset the human race with the flood and Noah's family, we see that by the time Noah's great-grandson comes upon the world, I might have said grandson earlier, it was Noah's great-grandson, I believe, Nimrod, we find that there was a birth of false religion, the exaltation of man at the Tower of Babel, and upon dispersing of the languages, it continued to reproduce all across the world. So we see the history of the term Babylon, and we see the reason she's called a mother. Fourth and last fact that we're going to see from the description of Babylon. Look, if you will, at verse 6. It says, and when I saw the woman drunken with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. And when I saw her, I wondered with great admiration or great amazement. In other words, the fourth fact you need to know is this woman is a murderer. She's a murderer. Very simple, straightforward, not a lot to really say about that. She's a murderer. So, folks, what do we have here? Let's go back and recover. We have 3 introductory facts. Babylon is called a woman, but not just any woman. She is an immoral woman. Number 2, we see that she's located upon many waters. We haven't still discussed that yet. Number 3, she has a certain relationship with both kings and the peoples of the world. But we've also seen a description of Babylon, and we've seen 4 different facts about the description of Babylon. We see that she is in control at this point in human history of human governments. It does appear. She's riding that beast. We also see that she is arrayed in great splendor and wealth. We also see that she's ancient. She is the mother of other harlots, and her name goes back a long, long way to the book of Genesis, and we see that she's a murderer. These are all clues trying to identify who Babylon is. But now let's move into verses 7 to the rest of the chapter, where we're going to talk about the explanation John's given. Now, forgive me. I'm going to do something that may not be best practice. I'm going to move through this pretty quickly, because we've already gone through this section. So I'm assuming you remember several months ago going through the details of this. Can I make that assumption? I am. All right, but I'm going to do this for you. I'm going to just give you bulleted items to remind you of what we see, and again help you kind of structure what we're seeing here. Because in the explanation that John has given about this woman Babylon, what we have in the explanation, folks, are just a couple of different things. First of all, in verses 8 down to verse 14, the explanation focuses exclusively on the beast itself. That's all it does. The woman is not even mentioned. It's like she's been forgotten for a little while. We will pick her back up in verse 15. So the first note of explanation is all about this beast that John has seen. And I just need to remind you of that because these are verses we've gone through already. What are some things we've seen about the beast? Well, number 1, in verse 8, the beast is explained in terms of an individual antichrist. Look at it. It says, "And that beast that thou sawest was and is not, and shall ascend out of the bottomless pit and go into perdition. And they that dwell on the earth shall wonder, whose names are not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they behold the beast that was and is not and yet is." And remember when we looked at that months ago, we scratched our head and went, what does that mean? He is and is not, yet he is again. Can y'all remember the explanation we gave to that? Why does John write that? Daniel? Yeah, chapter 13 clearly paints the picture of this individual beast that we call the Antichrist apparently is going to die, and he apparently will be raised again from the dead, and all this world is going to marvel because they end up doing what to this beast? They end up worshiping this beast in chapter 13. So I would argue verse 8 is all about that end times coming king, that coming dictator, the Antichrist. But verses 9 through 13, the beast is now being explained in terms of its governmental history and its structure. All right, now let's notice this. In terms of its history, verse 9 says, "And here is the mind that hath wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which this woman sitteth. And there are 7 kings, 5 have fallen, 1 is, and the other is not yet come. And when he cometh, he must continue a short space. And the beast that was and is not, even he is the 8th, and is of the 7th, and goeth into perdition." Now, let's stop right there. In other words, we have a little bit of history here, don't we? And I hope you remember this, but here's the history we covered. This historical beast is built on 7 kingdoms, or 7 kings. A little bit of interpretations here. And what we know about the history of this beast is that when John wrote it in verse 10, wrote about it, 5 of them had already taken place and had fallen. Then 1 currently existed in John's day as he was writing, and then 1 would exist in the future. And the great debate is about, well, who were the 5 that came before? We know the one that is. What has to be the one that is? It has to be Rome. Rome was the government. Rome was the kingdom that dominated during that age. Rome clearly was one of the 7 mountains that existed, one of the 7 kingdoms that existed. Who were the previous 5? Woo, boy, we have a lot of debate. That's a lot of debate. Some people debate whether or not John's talking about 5 specific kings that came before. Could be. Other people say, no, these are actually 5 totally different kingdoms. Could be. I'm not going to die on this hill. I don't know for sure. But I'll give you what I believe is probably what I think is right. But I may be wrong. I'm okay with that. Here's what I think it is. I think the 5 kingdoms that's being referenced here are the 5 kingdoms that God used throughout the nation of Israel to dominate them. That means that we would have to go back to Egypt, then we'd have to go back to Assyria, then Babylon, then Persia, then Greece. That would be 5 kingdoms. Now, you could argue there could be 5 different Roman emperors he's talking about here. That's another line of interpretation. But I kind of like this. That seems to make sense to me. And that means Rome would be the sixth kingdom that existed in John's day, but there's a seventh one coming. What's the seventh one? Well, that's going to be the end time one. But notice in verse 10, it says that when he cometh, the seventh one, he's going to exist a short space. Why? Because this kingdom is only going to last at most 7 years. It's not going to be very long. It'll be an end times kingdom. And then we find in verse 7 as well that this beast that is not, it says this beast was and is not. That's again, I think, his death and his resurrection. Even he is the eighth and is of the seventh. Say, why is that? Because, folks, apparently this seventh head, this seventh kingdom that will be reigned over by this Antichrist, when he dies and rises again, the nature of his kingdom is going to change to some extent, that he is going to be considered kind of an eighth kingdom, but he's still growing out of the seventh head. In other words, it's a continuation, but it's kind of a new thing. Say, why is it a new thing? Because he's been brought back to life. And some people argue perhaps even demon-possessed or satanically possessed because he actually comes out of the bottomless pit. He comes out of the pit of hell at this point. We don't know all the dynamics involved with this, but this will be the nature of this government beast. Now, that is the history, but look in verse 12, the structure of this government. It says in verse 12, "And the 10 horns which thou sawest are 10 kings, which have received no kingdom as yet, but receiveth power as kings 1 hour with the beast." Say, what does that mean? Well, we've already studied this a little bit, but folks, it seems very clear, both from Revelation 13 and Revelation 17, that these 10 kings, I would argue, are apparently 10 other rulers with the Antichrist. The way I kind of interpret it or describe it is I see these people as being the 10 cabinet members of the Antichrist. Maybe over different regions of the world that they control, but here's how it's structured. 10 other people who do have power. It says 1 hour, very short time with the Antichrist. You say, what's their agenda? Look at verse 13. It says they have one mind. They are in agreement about something, and here it is. They shall give their power and strength unto the beast. In other words, their agenda will be simply this. Let's elevate and exalt this Antichrist. Let's make sure his agenda is accomplished in the world. That will be their agenda. And folks, what we have then in verses 8 through verse 14, here's the other agenda, verse 14, I missed that. It says, they will make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb shall overcome them, for he is the Lord of lords and King of kings, and they that are with him are called and chosen and faithful. Their agenda is to elevate the Antichrist and to wage war against Jesus Christ. That will be their agenda. But verses 8 through verse 14 is all about the beast. I know I just ran through that very quickly. If you still got some questions, you can talk to me or go back and listen to other former sermons that I have online. But that's what the beast is all about. The question we still have, though, is, again, we're trying to identify Babylon. So what relationship will she have to this beast? Well, we know she's riding the beast. She apparently has some control over the beast, but notice how the beast is going to respond. Verse 15 tells us about the waters. It says this, the waters which thou sawest, where the whore sitteth, are peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues. So what's the interpretation of the waters we saw back in verse 1? What are the waters where she's located? It's the people of the world. Yeah, it's all the different languages and all the different nations and all. That's the waters. Apparently, this woman has some also controlling influence over the people of the world. But, verse 16, her influence is going to change. It says, of the 10 horns which thou sawest upon the beast, these shall hate the whore, and shall make her desolate and naked, and shall eat her flesh, and burn her with fire. Now, what does that mean? What's that?
One world religion will destroy all coming under one.
Okay, maybe. What's the relationship these 10 kings have to this woman? They're going to hate this woman. They're going to destroy this woman. You say, well, how do we interpret this then? How do we identify Babylon? Well, that's the title of this sermon, so let's see. Let's pull our clues together, okay? I'm kind of curious what you've come up with. We've got clues. First of all, she's a woman. She's a whorish woman. Second of all, she's influencing many people because she's riding on the waters of all the nations. She has a certain relationship to the kings of the earth and to all the other nations as well. On top of that, in the description, we have seen the fact that she apparently has some control over the government, over this beast. We've seen that she's decked out and gilded with absolutely incredible wealth. We have seen as well that she's ancient and goes back all the way to the time of Babel, where mankind rebelled against God, and I would argue also set up false religions. We also see as well that she is a murderer of those who are the true people of God. And we have noticed the details of this coming world government that's arising. And folks, we have also seen now at the end, this coming world government that's also being headed by these 10 kings are going to kill this woman. So who would you say is the woman, is Babylon? Just kind of curious after going through all those details.
The Antichrist?
No, it can't be the Antichrist. It's not human government. Something distinct from human government.
It's all individual stems of religion.
Okay, Stephen's going down the road I want to go down. Individual, how'd you say it? Stems of religions?
Like branches of
Okay.
it's one religion, but it's you can trace every world religion, like you said, with Tower of Babel.
Yeah. Stephen's going down the road and says there's all these different branches of religions coming out of her, so if she's the mother of them, then what is she? Okay, you're going to argue specifically the Catholic Church, but folks, I would argue, well, that's actually an interpretation that's very, very popular. Some people very hold to that, and we'll actually get to that a little more next week, probably. But folks, I would argue Babylon is nothing more, nothing less than all the false religions of the world. That's what it is. It's all the false religions of the world. So if that is the case, and I know it's an interpretation, but I think it's warranted in this passage, if that's the case, then why in the world are the 10 kings in verse 16 destroying Babylon of false religion? Okay. You know something? If you study the history of the world, and you study the history of governments, and you study the history of religion, how has governments and religion got on together? You know, some cases they got along together great. They were in cahoots together. And they understood that one could do what the other couldn't, and they could use each other to advance their cause. But in a lot of societies and a lot of cultures throughout history, government and religion have been at odds with one another. And they butted heads with each other over and over and over again. And I'm not talking about Christianity. I'm just talking about religious systems out there. They have just butted heads over and over again. In fact, in some cases, in a lot of cases throughout human history, it was the church, religion, let me say it that way, it was false religions who dominated human governments. Kings could not rule until certain priests or certain clerics gave approval that this person could rule. This is true going all the way back even to ancient Egypt in some cases. It was the priest that had a lot of the power in some cases in Egypt, and it was the case all the way through human history. And folks, I think what we have being described here in chapter 17 is a dynamic that's quite fascinating. That apparently as we get to this tribulational period of time, there is false religion still, isn't there? But what do we know about false religion during the tribulation? It's been united underneath one head. And in chapter 13, we saw the world is going to worship this Antichrist as God. And folks, there is going to come into play a false prophet in chapter 13. But have you ever thought about the fact, who gets the attention in chapter 13? Who's the one that's the mover and shaker of things in chapters 13? Who's the one that's the dominant personality in chapter 13? Well, there's two beasts in chapter 13. What's that? Well, the Antichrist is being worshipped as God, but who's the one that seems to be pulling all the strings? It's the false prophet in chapter 13. He's the one that's encouraging the world to worship the Antichrist, but he apparently is rolling out the edict that you have to fall down before that statue and worship it. He's the one that says you can't buy and sell if you don't get the mark. He's the one that seems to be in control of all this stuff around the world. And folks, it will not surprise me at all, by the time we continue through the tribulation period, after 2.5, 3 years pass, maybe 3.5 years, well, not 3.5 years, that's the end, but after about 3 years pass at this point, these 10 kings are probably going to get fed up with this. This false prophet who's been controlling all this and who's probably been encouraging the world and who's risen in promise before the world, who it says in chapter 13 has miracles to call fire down from heaven, people are going to be so amazed at this false prophet that apparently these kings can't stand it anymore. You think that sounds like human nature? You think that happens? Yeah, that has happened in the history of the world. In fact, you can go back and you can read of how political figures and kings literally commit murder against those in the church because they had too much power or too much influence within their kingdom and they got rid of them. Well, it's going to happen again one day. And in verse 16, apparently these 10 kings are going to do something. I don't know what it will be, but they are going to destroy false religion. You say, well, why is that taking place? Verse 17. It says, "For God hath put it in their hearts to fulfill his will and to agree and give their kingdom unto the beast, until the words of God shall be fulfilled." You know what that tells me? That is God's plan. His plan is to put down false religions. How is he going to do it? Shockingly, he's going to use human government. He's going to use these 10 kings. He's going to put it into their heart to destroy false religion. Say, why would God do that? Because, folks, God will brook no rival to his glory. He will brook no rival to his glory. We read it, Psalm 115 this morning. That's how we started our worship service this morning. The psalmist says, "Not unto us, O Lord, not unto us." That sounds like Babel. Let's make a name for ourselves. Not unto us, but let's give God the glory. And then in Psalm 115, what you have there is a listing of all these idols. They have mouths, but they can't speak, eyes, but they can't see, ears, but they can't hear. And the psalmist gets to the end of the false idols. He says, now listen, all you world, all you people, you need to fear God. You need to trust in him. That's what the psalmist in Psalm 115 is teaching. Why? Because God will brook no rivals. He has tolerated false religions all throughout human history. But one day he is going to put it down, men and women. And he's going to use, shockingly, these 10 kings to do it. You say, how he's going to do it? Okay, I'm going to end this sermon in a horrible way. This is how he's going to do it. Verse 18. "And the woman which thou sawest is that great city which reigneth over the kings of the earth." Wait a second. I just spent all this time building a case that this is false religion. Now the last verse of this chapter says, now wait a second, the woman actually is a great city. And she is reigning over the kings of the earth as I described it, but the question becomes, well, wait a second, if this is false religion, what's this city all about? I don't have time this morning to go into that. This is the cliffhanger of the sermon. That's chapter 18. In fact, you go through chapter 18, this city is mentioned over and over and over again in chapter 18. Next week, we'll have to figure out how in the world could a false religion be connected to a great city. Because I do believe it is a literal city that he's talking about here. We'll have to get into that. But folks, I want to leave you with this thought this morning. I know many of you have different family members and friends. And some of them, I was thinking of Diane's cousin who's in the Roman Catholic Church. And he's so steeped in the Roman Catholic Church, so blinded by that. Others of you perhaps maybe have friends who are Mormons. And they're so blinded by the Mormon Church and the teachings that are there. Maybe some of you have people that you know that are Muslim, and they adhere to the Muslim faith. And they're so blinded by that. And some of these people are very precious to you, know them. And honestly, when you think of when you think of the Catholic Church, or you think of the Muslims, or you think of the Mormons, and you think of what that false religion is doing to them, there's something in your heart that just grieves. There's something in your heart, frankly, that gets almost angry at the fact that all these false religions are out there, because you know, folks, at the end of the day, they're stealing God's glory, but second of all, they are deceiving the peoples of the world. Well, what this passage is telling us is that one day, God is going to destroy that whole system. And I want to leave you with that confidence this morning, that as you're going to the world, you think to yourself, but boy, these false religions are so strong, and you know, what can we do? They've been with us for hundreds of years, and people have followed their pageantries, and you watch them on television, or sometimes you can visit some of these places, and you see they're literally gilded in gold, and they have these huge edifices, and they literally use cups that are golden cups and chalices that they use for their different services and different observances, and you go, but it looks so impressive. Well, folks, take heart. It's all coming down one day. God will brook no rival. I'm going to leave you with that thought. Next week, I'm going to have to pick it back up in chapter 18, and we'll continue on. But let's close in prayer. Our Heavenly Father, we come back before you this morning. And as we've investigated this chapter, we've explored the details here. Father, I pray that we would once again cause our hope to be founded in you. To know that even though we have family members and friends and relatives who are being deceived by false religions, and perhaps we can even look at our life and see the times that we hang our head because we recognize we were ignorant of God and we were caught in something like that. But Father, we rejoice because we know that one day you are going to deal with the religions of the world who have stolen the glory of our God. And I pray this morning, Father, that we would also use this passage as motivation, because apparently all those who are caught in those kinds of religions and systems will also be destroyed unless they come to Jesus Christ. And I pray, Father, that this would be another passage that really motivates us and hastens us to once again urge people to consider the claims of Jesus, that He is truly God and He became man and He died for our sins and rose again and He reigns at the right hand of the Father and He's returning one day to put all this down. And Father, I pray that we would be motivated this week with an intensity to help people recognize that they are entrapped in the traditions of their religions that go back all the way at least to Babylon. And Father, I pray that you would grant to us a steadfast assurance that one day Jesus Christ will stand as King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and all people will see that He truly is worthy of all worship and service. We pray this in His name. Amen.